Hi everyone, welcome. The bin that you see here is one of my worm bins that's I guess among the youngest. Although at this point I've got about a half a dozen other bins that are younger. But still at about 3 months of age, 97 days to be exact. At 97 days of age, it's certainly not an old bin. At least not by my current standards. In the past I used to treat, 100 days as middle age and 150 as pretty old, close to needing to be harvested. 200 used to be like a real anomaly to bring my worm bins to 200 days of age. But more recently I've been doing that exact thing, bringing a lot of my bins to a year old before bringing them to completion. But with this system, I think we were suspecting that it might not make it that far, mainly because it was one of the few bins. I was running a little bit of a test period, but I've since kind of turned away from trying to do things that way. I was trying to follow this thinking that I should try to start my new bins almost at capacity, filled up, and then this way the worms would have plenty of room, and then maybe even by having a lot of room they would be kind of encouraged to mate and increase their numbers, expand their size as far as population goes. But then what I found out was by doing it that way, I felt like I was kind of shooting myself in the foot, because the way I like to work in my bins is I like to till things up and aerate everything, and that sort of causes everything to fluff up and expand in size. Not to mention that, when I go to excavate the feeding zone, I need a lot of room to stack up the materials that I'm pulling out of the hole. And then I really feel like I've kind of worked my way into a corner by not having enough space to get the job done without the risk of possibly spilling stuff over the edge of the container. So in the beginning I was referring to this system as my nearly at capacity system, but luckily the worms have been quite busy working the materials that we gave them down into vermicompost. As you can see, this system is really making nice progress. There's clearly evidence of the paper products and leaves and other things that were used as bedding down in the feeding area. But elsewhere in the bin, perhaps after we feed, we'll excavate and explore the rest of the bin outside of the middle where we've last fed. We'll probably see very little of that sort of stuff, because these worms have been working hard at transforming the contents of this container into compost, leading me to believe that we'll probably need to harvest the material and move the worms onto greener pastures a lot sooner than what's been going on in a lot of my other older systems. So we're finding very little leftover material in here other than just the bedding, because it has been 2 weeks since we last fed this system. That last feeding was feeding number 8 for this 97-day-old system, only 3 days away from hitting 100 days of age. And it felt like after 14 days since the last feeding, waiting another 3 days just to, to prevent us from checking in too early and making it into, well, what am I trying to say? Instead of holding off until day 100 for the next check-in to time it out with their 100 days in service milestone birthday, it felt like, waiting 17 days between feedings would be a bit much. That's why I'm in here after 2 weeks to feed them again, because that last feeding they got was, I think it was maybe some coffee and some leaves or whatever it was. It just didn't seem like a whole lot. And I guess what I've got for them today isn't really a whole lot either. A lot of times I, do use my prepared bedding, which is shredded paper and cardboard and leaves. And I do have my supply of prepared bedding, but I think today's bedding is going to consist of some paper products that I just need to do away with. Stuff that's been sort of piling up. You saw a whole bunch of those coffee filters over there too. I thought I would try to do away with some of my paper products that I've been stacking up here. Used napkins and paper towels will go down here in the bottom as the foundation for today's feeding. And then in can come not only those various food scraps that I came down here with, but I've also got a whole bunch of coffee too, almost an entire quart of coffee that needs to be done away with. So why don't we start right into piling in some of the coffee I bought down here for them. Perhaps we'll even create 2 layers of coffee because I've got so much. And before we start piling in some of those yummy kitchen scraps for them, I'll typically go into the coffee portion and combine it with some of my worm chow here, presumably making it into something that the worms like, because I feel like I rarely see anything that appears to be leftovers of the coffee and worm chow combination, although it does appear like vermicompost. The stuff certainly does have that appearance to it. So let's see, what are they getting today? Sometimes I'll take these coffee filters and I'll use them as sort of little wraps for the food. And look, I got so many of them. I got 4 of them here, so I thought maybe they can sort of go in here as little containers into which the food portions could be positioned, possibly making them into the sort of bedding material that's not going to show up as leftovers by having the food placed into it. So let's see, these are, you might recognize them, these are like the leaves or the bunches of radish, combined with even some of the cut off ends of some of the radishes. And those can go in like so. There was this corn cob. A lot of time it's just the cob that I'm giving to my worm bins, but here they're actually even getting the corn kernels. Sometimes when you prepare just a little bit too much corn and you assume that you're going to eat it as leftovers at some point soon, and then it ends up sitting in the refrigerator for way too long, it gets a little bit nasty, and it seems like, perhaps it's been sitting around for too long and it's time to just simply give it to the wormies. So that's a pretty nice feeding. I think it's possibly a little bit more generous than what I gave them last time. But these worms seem to be doing a pretty good job. The stuff I'm sprinkling in here is pulverized eggshell. That's the form of grit that I use in my worm bins. And now this is kind of nice too, to be able to do away with even more of this coffee, because I have quite a bit of it piling up here. Although to use an entire container like this in just one bin, a lot of times I'll empty a container like this into 2 bins when I'm feeding 2 bins, but this is just one of those bins that hasn't really been paired up with another buddy bin. So this bin is simply being managed solo, which actually gives us a little bit better view into what's going on down here by the camera being able to just focus on what's going on in only one bin instead of trying to keep tabs on 2 side-by-side bins. People do seem to like the greater amount of detail that you get by being able to come up close and see what's happening here. Is this the stem of a banana maybe? Could be. So it did seem like we encountered a little bit of leftover bedding material here and there, possibly a little bit of leftover food too. This even looks like part of the seed from a avocado. Becomes pretty fragile over time. And then there was little bits of leftover bedding, but not a whole lot of it. And then over here too, I had scraped up some stuff that was just sort of sitting out on the top surface, possibly a little drier than the rest of the material in the bin. That's the sort of stuff I like to try to get back into the mix by putting it down near the feeding area to try to increase the attention it's been getting, assuming that it's been getting very little attention by being out on the surface and turning a bit dry. Alright, so I think it's time that we can begin covering up the feeding zone. Usually I'll use that as an excuse to just kind of go really far out to the very opposite edges of the bin, the 2 outer opposite edges of the bin, to just aerate the material, inspect how the stuff's coming along, make sure everything looks pretty good out there. Sometimes I forget to do this and I sort of get tunnel vision. I just look down the middle of the bin where we're feeding, focus on only doing that, and then once in a while these outskirts of the bins just get neglected a little bit. But I've been making it a habit, or I've been trying to make it a habit, to make sure I'm keeping tabs on the entire contents of the container to make sure everything's doing well. So many nice fluffy castings throughout this bin everywhere. There's also little bits of bedding scattered throughout, but the worms really are doing a fine job on this 97-day-old container, receiving its 9th feeding today, and pretty generous feeding. But with the worms being as busy as they are in this system, I'm not sure if waiting 2 weeks between feedings is such a good idea. When I launch a single bin like this, it usually means that there's a somewhat larger number of worms occupying it than when I have buddy bins that were both launched on the same day. A lot of times 2 bins launched on the same day is a sign of the fact that I had launched those 2 systems with the occupants that used to inhabit a single bin, splitting the population, trying to give them more room so that they'll, mate and increase their numbers. But I believe in the case of this system, I had simply transferred the entire contents of a single finished bin into this system, meaning it's a somewhat larger population than many of my other systems, making it quite capable, and for that other reason making me think that it's going to come to the finish line pretty soon. And just from looking at the material too, I mean, that's just the sense that I get, that whatever we throw at these guys, they're going to turn it into vermicompost, and the system will be ready for harvest possibly a lot sooner than many of the systems that I've been able to run up into 300 plus days of age. Alright, well, that's pretty much it for our check-in here with these red wiggler worms. They're doing a wonderful job. The castings are so nice and fluffy. The moisture level in here is quite good. Everything in this system seems to be humming along just right. So let's just hope it keeps going that way. Alright, let's return our feeding zone indicator. This coffee filter seemed to be holding up well enough that we could just put it back into service as we had found it as the feeding zone indicator. And then back on can come these paper-based coverings, which just seem to be providing enough coverage to not let the system become too dry, but also the top surface didn't seem like it was too wet either. I kind of wondered if a thicker object like this on top would cause the sort of recirculation as a piece of plastic does, but it does seem to be remaining dry enough that the worms aren't nibbling their way through and creating a lot of moisture, which is just fine. I'm okay with that, as long as the material down below it is in good shape. Alright everyone, that's it for our check-in with these worms. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.